We've got sick men. They're so weak.
Pine needles. You must use them.
Ayita said this might help.
When you think of cowboys, you picture shootouts, at high noon saloon brawls, and lone riders disappearing into the sunset. But here's the truth that Hollywood never told you: the real history of the American West wasn't written with bullets. It was written with beef and beans. Between 1865 and 1895, a peculiar economic madness gripped America. In Texas, a Longhorn steer, those magnificent beasts with horns, stretching 6 feet across, cost about $3. You could buy one for less than a good pair of boots. But in New York City or Chicago, that same animal was worth $40. Some fetched even more. The problem was simple, yet seemingly impossible. How do you turn a fortune on 4 legs into actual cash when it's standing 1,000 miles away from the nearest railroad? The answer created one of the most remarkable occupations in American history: the cattle drive. Picture this: 10 to 15 men driving 3,000 head of cattle across endless prairies, through rivers that could drown a horse, past native territories, through storms that could scatter a herd in seconds, all for wages that would make a modern fast food worker weep. And in the middle of this moving chaos, there was one man who held more power than anyone except the trail boss himself. He wasn't the fastest draw. He wasn't the best rider. He was often the oldest, sometimes crippled, and he commanded the second highest salary in the outfit. His name was Samuel Cookie Crawford, but everyone just called him Cookie. He was the mother, the doctor, and the judge of the prairie. And without him, the entire American beef industry would have collapsed before it began. But this isn't just Cookie's story. It's the story of how a Cherokee woman named Ayita saved his life, his crew, and ultimately became the woman who would wait for him through 15 winters of separation. The army of cattle and the brutal hierarchy. Let me paint you a picture of organized chaos. Imagine 3,000 head of cattle, 3,000 massive long-horned beasts, stretching out for over a mile across the open prairie, moving like a living brown river flowing north. Now, looking at old paintings, you might think this was just a random mob of animals drifting across the plains. It wasn't. This was a military operation executed with Roman precision. Every man had a specific place in the formation, and where you rode determined your paycheck, your status, and how much dust you had to eat. 1. The general, the trail boss at the very front, sometimes riding 10 or 15 miles ahead of the herd, was the trail boss. He wasn't just a cowboy, he was the general. He was part explorer, part diplomat, and part psychologist. He rode ahead to scout for water in the drying riverbeds, to negotiate passage fees with angry landowners or tribal chiefs, and to decide exactly where the herd would sleep each night. One wrong decision from him, missing a water hole by 5 miles, could kill the entire herd. His salary reflected that life or death responsibility: $100 to $125 per month. In an era where a good Colt revolver cost $15, this was a king's ransom. 2. The aristocrats, the point men riding just behind him at the very point of the herd, were 2 men, 1 on each side. These were the point men. These were the aristocrats of the cowboy world. To ride point, you didn't need the fastest horse or the quickest gun. You needed something much rarer: intelligence. You had to understand cattle psychology. They were the steering wheel of this massive machine. If a point man nudged the lead steer to the left, the 3,000 animals behind him would follow like clockwork. These men were the top hands, respected by everyone. 3. The sergeant's swing and flank, stretching back along the sides of this mile-long column, were the swing men and the flank men. Think of them as the sergeants. Their job was to keep the river flowing straight. They spent their days riding up and down the line, pushing strays back into formation, making sure the herd didn't spread out too wide. It was hard, skilled labor, earning them a solid $30 to $40 a month. But at the very back, at the end of the line, lies a different world entirely. 4. The hell the dragmen, if riding point was heaven, riding drag was hell on earth. Let me tell you about the dragmen, because their suffering tells you more about the real West than any John Wayne movie ever could. Why was this position so feared? Let's do the math. You have 30 cattle ahead of you. Each cow has 4 hooves. That is 12 hooves pounding the dry, hard-packed earth of Texas hour after hour. Those hooves didn't just kick up dirt. They pulverized the grass, the soil, and most importantly, tons of dried manure into a fine, suffocating powder. As the herd moved, it generated a massive hanging cloud of brown fog. And the dragmen, they lived inside that cloud for 12 hours a day, every day, for 3 months. A dragman couldn't see the sky. He couldn't see the horizon. Often he couldn't even see the horse he was riding. He existed in a world of choking dust. This dust coated everything. It filled their ears, matted their hair, and clogged their noses. It mixed with the sweat pouring down their faces under the 100-degree sun to form a layer of caustic sludge on their skin. There is a haunting detail from the diaries of old cowboys. They said that at the end of the day, when a dragman climbed out of the saddle, he didn't look human anymore. He looked like a golem made of mud. But when he took off his hat and wiped his face, the only clean spots left were his eyes. 2 wide white circles staring out of a blackened face. They called them raccoon eyes. This is why the bandana, that wild rag, was invented. It wasn't a fashion statement. It wasn't to look cool. It was a piece of survival equipment. Without a bandana tied tight over his nose and mouth, a drag rider would literally suffocate, or his lungs would fill with enough silica and bacteria to give him pneumonia within a week. 5. The apprentice, the wrangler. Finally, behind even the dragmen came the wrangler. Usually the youngest kid in the crew, sometimes just 15 years old. He managed the remuda, the herd of spare horses. You see, a cowboy couldn't ride one horse all day. Cutting cattle is exhausting work. A horse would blow a lung or collapse. So every cowboy needed a string of 6 to 8 fresh horses a day. The wrangler was the lowest rank, the little brother of the group. But even he looked at the dragmen with pity. Because at least back there with the horses, the air was breathable. Cookie and the Rolling Fortress. Now let me tell you about Samuel Crawford Cookie. 5 years ago, Cookie had been one of those point men riding at the head of the herd with the pride and confidence of a man who'd mastered his trade. He was 32 years old, strong as an ox, and known up and down the Chisholm Trail as one of the best cattle handlers in Texas. Then came the day that changed everything. A young bull, spooked by a rattlesnake, charged directly at Cookie's horse. The horse reared. Cookie fell. And before he could roll clear, 1,500 pounds of angry Longhorn drove a horn clean through his left thigh. They got him to a doctor in Fort Worth, but the leg healed crooked. He could walk barely with a pronounced limp, but he could never again spend 12 hours in the saddle. His days as a cowboy were over, or so everyone thought. The trail boss who'd employed Cookie for 6 years made him an offer. You know the trail. You know the men. And you're the only one who can make biscuits that don't break teeth. Become my cook. $60 a month. It was the second highest salary in the outfit. More money than he'd ever made as a cowboy. And it was the only way he could stay in the life he loved. So Cookie learned a new trade. He learned to command the chuckwagon, that 4-wheeled fortress that was part hospital, part kitchen, part courthouse. The chuckwagon, Cookie's kingdom. The chuckwagon wasn't just a wagon. It was Cookie's entire world. At the back sat the chuckbox, a wooden cabinet with a hinged door that folded down to create a work surface. Inside were dozens of small compartments, each precisely organized, one for salt, one for pepper, 1 for baking soda, 1 for bandages, 1 for needles and thread. This was Cookie's domain, and it was as inviolable as a judge's chambers. There was an unwritten law on every cattle drive you could borrow a cowboy's horse in an emergency. You could even borrow his gun, but you never ever touched Cookie's chuck box without permission. Men had been fired or worse for that offense. Underneath the wagon, stretched between the axles, like a hammock, hung the possum belly, a leather or canvas sling that carried firewood and more commonly dried buffalo or cattle chips. Mounted on the side was a water barrel holding 150 to 200 liters. In a landscape where you might travel 30 miles between water sources, this barrel was worth more than gold. But Cookie's most prized possession was a ceramic keg about the size of a football, wrapped in cloth and treated with more care than a newborn baby. Inside this keg lived his sourdough starter, a bubbling mixture of flour, water, and wild yeast that had to be fed every single day. Here's why this mattered in the 1870, as no baking powder in little tins. There was no packaged yeast in neat squares. If you wanted bread to rise, you needed a living culture of wild yeast that you kept alive through constant attention. And if that culture died from freezing, from overheating, from neglect, you had no bread. Just dense, tooth-breaking sinkers that could be used as weapons. On freezing winter nights, when temperatures dropped below zero, Cookie would wrap that sourdough keg in blankets and sleep with it tucked against his chest. His body heat kept the yeast alive. Cowboys joked that Cookie loved his sourdough more than he'd ever loved a woman. They didn't know how right they were. Because that starter had come from a woman, Cookie had never forgotten a woman he'd met on his very first cattle drive 15 years ago. The fuel problem, prairie coal. Now let me tell you about something that would shock your grandchildren: what Cookie used for fuel. Out on the Great Plains, that vast treeless ocean of grass stretching from Texas to Canada, there was no firewood. You could ride for 100 miles and not see a single tree bigger than a sapling. So what did Cookie burn to cook 3 hot meals a day for 15 hungry men? The answer has a polite name: prairie coal. The honest name: dried cow manure. Before you recoil in disgust, let me explain the science. Fresh manure is wet, smelly, and useless. But manure that's been baking in the prairie sun for weeks becomes something else entirely. It dries into hard, curved discs. They called them cow chips, that are odorless, light as cork, and burn with a steady, even heat like peat from Ireland. There was even an etiquette to collecting them. When the outfit stopped for the night, every available hand, except the trail boss, had to go gathering fuel. The rule was simple: pick only the chips that were bone-dry and curved. If you could tap 2 together and hear a hollow clock sound like wood, they were ready. If they were still soft, leave them for another week. The chips burned slowly with a sweet smell of grass, not the stench you'd expect. And they produced the steady, moderate heat Cookie needed for his Dutch oven cooking. The Dutch oven, Cookie's orchestra. Cookie's most important tool was his Dutch oven. This wasn't your grandmother's stew pot. This was a cast iron cauldron with 3 legs so it could stand over coals without smothering the fire, and a flat lid with a raised rim so you could pile hot coals on top without ash falling into the food when you lifted the lid. The Dutch oven was Cookie's concert hall, and he was the conductor. To bake biscuits that were golden on top and fluffy inside, without burning the bottom, he had to master the art of heat distribution. The rule was this: more heat on top than bottom. For a 12-inch oven, Cookie would place 8 coals underneath and 14 on the lid. This created an internal temperature of about 350 F, perfect for baking. But here's the trick that separated great cooks from mediocre ones. Every 15 minutes, Cookie would rotate the lid 90 degrees clockwise and rotate the pot 90 degrees counterclockwise. This prevented hot spots and ensured even cooking. Young cowboys would watch in amazement as Cookie, after judging the coals by sight and feel alone, would produce 20 perfect golden biscuits that steamed when you broke them open. The menu from shock fuel coffee to terrifying stews. If you think the most dangerous thing on a cattle drive was a stampede or a bandit attack, you're missing the bigger picture. The real battle wasn't fought with guns, it was fought in the gut. To understand the psychology of the American cowboy, you have to understand what he put in his stomach. You see, when you strip away the romance of the West, you are left with 15 men burning 40 calories a day, fueled by a diet that would send a modern nutritionist into shock. Arbuckles, the currency of the plains. The day didn't start with the sun, it started with the smell. Specifically, the smell of Arbuckles Ariosa coffee. In the late 19th century, Arbuckles wasn't just a brand, it was the gasoline of the frontier. The Arbuckle brothers were essentially the first geniuses of American food marketing. They coated their beans in a patented glaze of egg whites and sugar. This wasn't for flavor, it was a hermetic seal to keep the beans from rotting during the months-long journey through damp rivers and dusty plains. But the brilliance didn't stop at the glaze. Inside every bright yellow 1-pound package was a peppermint stick. This was the carrot used to bribe the youngest crew member into cranking the grinder at 3:00 a.m. But there was something else on the bag, something even more valuable than the candy signature. The Arbuckle package featured the signature of the company owner. If a cowboy saved enough of these signatures, cut them right off the paper bags, he could redeem them for rewards. This was the first loyalty program in American history. A crew might save coupons for months to send away for a pair of suspenders, a razor, or, if they drank enough caffeine, to stop a heartache. 38 caliber revolver. The secret ingredient buffalo-wallow water, however, the coffee itself, that was a different story. Cookie would brew it cowboy style, dumping the grounds directly into boiling water. But here is the detail the movies leave out. Where did the water come from? There were no plumbing systems on the Chisholm Trail. There were no filtered springs in the middle of the staked plains. Cookie had to get water wherever he could find it. Often, that meant a buffalo-wallow. For those who don't know, a buffalo-wallow is a depression in the ground where a 20-pound bison has rolled around to scratch its back. When it rained, these depressions filled up. But they didn't just fill with water. They filled with mud, bison urine, manure, and thousands of mosquito larvae. This was the water Cookie used for your morning brew. To make it drinkable, Cookie had a trick of chemistry. He would slice up prickly pear cactus leaves and toss them into the barrel. The sticky sap from the cactus acted as a flocculant. It grabbed onto the dirt and larvae, sinking them to the bottom, so he could scoop the clean water off the top. Even so, cowboys often joked that their coffee had texture and was strong enough to float a horseshoe. If the horseshoe sank, the coffee wasn't ready. Nooning, the misery of lunch. The midday meal known as nooning was devoid of joy. There was no stopping, no table, and no rest. Lunch consisted of cold shrapnel leftover biscuits from breakfast that had hardened into rocks and jerky. Now forget the soft teriyaki-flavored beef jerky you buy at a gas station today. 1870s jerky was raw beef salted heavily and dried in the sun until it had the consistency of shoe leather. It was so hard that cowboys often couldn't bite through it. They would put a piece in their cheek and let it rehydrate with their own saliva for an hour before they could chew it. It was salty, tough, and notoriously hard on the teeth. Supper and the deceitful beans. The real culinary event was supper. This was the domain of the 4 B's: beans, bacon, biscuits, and beef. Let's talk about the beans. They were usually pinto beans imported from Mexico. The cowboys called them pecos strawberries, or whistleberries. Cookie would soak them overnight and simmer them all day with salt pork. But a diet consisting almost entirely of beans and salted meat had a very real, very loud social consequence. In a small camp where men slept in a circle around the fire, flatulence wasn't just a joke. It was a genuine source of tension. They called them deceitful beans because they talked behind your back. Cookie would often throw a handful of chili peppers into the pot, not just for flavor, but because the capsaicin was believed to help speed up digestion and reduce the night music. The most valuable commodity at supper wasn't the meat, it was the grease. Bacon grease was Texas butter. It was liquid gold. Cookie saved every drop. He used it to make gravy, a thick white calorie, dense sludge made from flour water or tinned milk and grease. This gravy was poured over everything. It was the only source of fat these men had to keep their bodies warm during freezing nights on the open range. The son of a bitch stew, and then there was the legend. The dish that has become synonymous with the brutality and ingenuity of the trail. If you look in old cookbooks, you might see it listed politely as Cleveland stew or man stew. But on the trail, it had only one name, and they didn't whisper it son of a bitch stew. This dish was born of necessity. When a calf was injured or lost its mother, it had to be slaughtered. In the middle of nowhere, you throw nothing away. The muscle meat was dried for jerky, but the organs, they had to be eaten immediately. Cookie would fire up the Dutch oven and toss in a horror show of anatomy: the heart, the liver, the tongue, the brains, the kidneys, and the sweetbreads. But the secret ingredient, the thing that elevated this from a pile of guts to a delicacy, was the marrow gut. This is where the squeamish should look away. The marrow gut, or tripa, is the tube connecting the two stomachs of a nursing calf. Because the calf has only ever consumed its mother's milk, this tube isn't filled with waste. It is filled with a substance called chyme partially digested milk enzymes. When Cookie chopped this tube into rings and threw it into the stew, the heat didn't make it rot. It cooked the chyme into a rich, creamy cheese-like substance. It acted as a natural thickening agent. To a modern palate, eating a calf's milk-filled intestine sounds like a nightmare. But to a cowboy who had eaten nothing but dry beans and salty leather for 6 weeks, the marrow gut tasted like the finest French PT. It was rich, fatty, and creamy, a texture they craved desperately. It was the only time they felt like kings. Spotted pup, the psychology of sugar. Finally, if the drive was going well, Cookie might serve dessert. Sugar was rare and expensive, but sometimes Cookie would make spotted pup. This was simply rice boiled with molasses and raisins. The raisins stood out against the white rice like spots on a Dalmatian puppy. It wasn't a complex dish. It was a sticky, overly sweet pudding. But you have to understand the psychology for these men living in a world of dust blood and brute force. A spoonful of spotted pup was a reminder of home. It was a reminder of mothers and kitchens and a life before the trail. When Cookie served spotted pup, the camp would go silent. Hardened men with scars on their faces and guns on their hips would eat their pudding with the quiet reverence of children. PART5THECRISIS and THEWOMANWUHOSAVEDTHEM 190240. It was the 8th week of the drive when Cookie first noticed something was wrong. Tom Martinez, one of the swing riders, complained that his gums hurt when he drank his morning coffee. Cookie dismissed it, probably just tobacco irritation. But the next morning, 2 more men mentioned the same thing. By the end of the week, it wasn't just complaints. It was blood. When the Cowboys brushed their teeth, those few who bothered their gums bled profusely. Their mouths turned a swollen, angry purple. But the most terrifying symptom was the scars. Old wounds from years ago began to split open, spontaneously oozing fresh blood. It was as if their bodies were falling apart from the inside. Cookie tried everything in his limited medicine chest. He forced men to drink whiskey to purify the blood. He gave them calomel, toxic mercury chloride, which usually just poisoned them faster. He even made them drink raw beef blood for strength. Nothing worked. Men were becoming weaker by the day. The youngest drag rider, 16-year-old Billy, collapsed while gathering cow chips and couldn't get up. The trail boss pulled Cookie aside one evening. "If this doesn't stop, We're going to lose the herd. We might lose the men. Cookie knew he was right. They were 3 weeks from Kansas. At this rate, half the crew would be dead before they saw a railroad. The trading post then, as if by providence, they reached a Cherokee settlement near the Kansas border. While the trail boss traded for fresh horses, Cookie watched Cherokee women bartering at a small trading post. They brought vegetables and leather to trade for flour and coffee. One woman caught Cookie's attention. She was older, with silver streaking her dark hair, moving with quiet authority. She carried a basket of dried herbs. Cookie, desperate, limped over. He removed his hat and tried to explain his problem through gestures. Men. Sick, he said, pointing to his mouth and making a bleeding gesture. He pointed to the old scars on his arm, indicating they were reopening. The woman listened carefully, her dark eyes studying his face. She nodded slowly and spoke in Cherokee to a young man standing nearby her son. The young man translated, "My mother says she knows this sickness. She has seen it before in hard winters, when our people had no fresh food. She says it comes from eating only old meat for too long." Cookie felt a surge of hope. "Can she cure it?" The son translated. "She can show you the medicine, but you must follow her instructions exactly, or the medicine will be poison." The medicine woman, her name was Ayita. It meant first to dance. She led Cookie to a grove of pine trees at the edge of the settlement. As she gathered handfuls of young light green pine needles, her son Sequoia translated her warning, "Not all evergreens are safe. The yew tree with flat, dark needles is death. Even a small amount stops a man's heart. The ponderosa pine will make cattle lose their calves. You must use only white pine spruce or fir." Ayita showed Cookie how to select only the youngest needles from the branch tips. "Old needles are too bitter," Sequoia explained. Then came the crucial instruction. Ayita mimed boiling water, then emphatically gestured no when reaching for the needles. "Never boil the needles," Sequoia warned. "Heat destroys the medicine. Boil the water first, remove it from the fire, then add the crushed needles. Let them steep like tea." Cookie listened with intense concentration. His crew's lives depended on remembering every detail. Brewing back at the chuck wagon, Cookie followed Ayita's instructions exactly. He sent the healthier cowboys to gather young pine needles. He crushed them between rocks to release the oils, then brought a pot of water to a rolling boil. The moment it boiled, he pulled it off the fire and threw in the needles. He covered the pot tight. 15 minutes later, the result was a pale yellow-green liquid with a thin film of oil on top. It smelled like Christmas, sharp and piney, but the taste, it was bitter, astringent, and coated the mouth like liquid lumber. Cookie added a heavy dose of molasses to make it palatable, then lined up the sick men. "It tastes like turpentine," Cookie growled, "but the Cherokee woman says it's the cure. Drink." The cowboys gagged, cursed, and accused him of poisoning them. But they drank, because when Cookie gave an order about food or medicine, you obeyed. The miracle: within 2 days, the bleeding stopped. Cookie could hardly believe it. Men who had been spitting blood woke up with clean mouths. The purple swelling in their gums receded. Within 3 days, the crushing fatigue lifted. Men who could barely sit a horse were riding full shifts again. Within a week, even the reopened scars began to heal. Young Billy was back to eating dust and complaining, a sure sign of life. What Cookie didn't know, what nobody in the 1870s could know, was that those pine needles contained 5 times more vitamin C than an equal weight of oranges. That thin, bitter tea had delivered exactly what those men's bodies were screaming for at the cellular level. The Cherokee woman had saved 15 lives with knowledge that white doctors in their universities had never learned. The trade, when the outfit was ready to move on, Cookie sought out Ayita. He brought her 50 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of sugar, and his personal wool blanket. It was a fortune on the trail. "Tell her she saved my crew," Cookie told Sequoia. "Tell her I owe her my life." Ayita accepted the goods, but spoke at length to her son. Sequoia turned to Cookie. My mother says the trade is not equal. You have given things she can buy. She has given knowledge that cannot be bought. She says if you wish to repay her, take me with you. Take you teach me to cook for the Cowboys, Sequoia said. Pay me a helper's wages. I will return home before winter with money for my family. Cookie looked at the trail boss, who shrugged. We could use a hand who knows the country. Agreed, Cookie said. He looked at Ayita. Ma'am, I'll teach your boy everything I know. And I'll make sure he comes home safe. But Cookie had another motive. He wanted to learn everything this young man knew about prairie plants. Every healing herb. Every edible root. If Cookie was going to keep men alive on the trail, he needed to become more than just a cook. He needed to become a medicine man. Here is the part of the story that Cookie never told the other cowboys. The part he kept locked away in his heart for 15 years. That Cherokee woman, Ayita, wasn't the first time he'd met her. 15 years earlier, Cookie had been a young cowboy named Samuel Crawford, riding his very first cattle drive at 22. He was a green drag rider, eating dust and dreaming of glory. That first drive stopped at the same Cherokee settlement. Young Samuel saw a beautiful Cherokee girl, barely 18, helping her mother trade baskets. Her name was Ayita. First to dance. Samuel bought a pair of moccasins, paying too much just to see her smile. For 3 days they found excuses to meet. They couldn't speak the same language fluently, but they managed through the universal language of young love. On his last night, Ayita gave him a gift, a small ceramic jar wrapped in cloth. It was a sourdough starter from her grandmother. So you will always have bread, she said. And so you will remember me. Samuel promised to return. But cattle drives are brutal. Most men spend their wages in saloons and never look back. But Samuel wasn't most men. 3 years later he returned. He found Ayita still unmarried, waiting. They married in a Cherokee ceremony Samuel didn't fully understand, but respected deeply. For 3 months, he lived with her people, learning to hunt in winter and speak their language. When spring came, Samuel faced an impossible choice: stay in poverty or leave her to earn the cash wages her family desperately needed. Ayita made the choice for him. Go, she said. Earn the white man's money. Come back when the snow falls. I will be here. The cycle, and so began the pattern that defined their marriage. Every spring, Samuel, now called Cookie, left for the cattle drive. He was gone for 7 months. Every fall, he returned to the settlement with his wages $60 per drive. He handed it all to Ayita. They had 4 months together each year. Cookie helped with winter chores, and Ayita cooked traditional food while listening to his stories of the trail. They had 3 children, 2 daughters who learned their mother's medicine, and a son who learned to handle horses from his father. The hardest part was explaining to the children why their father left every year. Your father brings us money so we can buy what we cannot make, Ayita would say. And he always comes back. And Cookie always did. Through stampedes, river crossings, and injuries that left him crippled, he always came back. The sourdough, that starter Ayita gave him, Cookie, kept it alive for 15 years. He fed it every day, even in blizzards. He slept with it tucked against his chest on freezing nights. Every time he fed that yeast, he thought of Ayita. Every loaf of bread was a connection to her. The Cowboys joked that Cookie loved his sourdough more than any woman. They had no idea how right they were and how wrong. He loved the sourdough because it was Ayita's gift, a living thing connecting them across hundreds of miles. The recognition now, 15 years later, the circle was complete. Cookie had returned to the settlement, and Ayita, now a respected healer, had saved his crew. When he first approached her at the trading post to ask for the cure, she recognized him instantly. But she maintained her composure, treating him as a stranger to protect his reputation among the white cowboys. Only later, when her son Sequoia joined the crew as a helper, did the truth come out. One night by the campfire, Cookie spoke quietly to the boy. "Your mother and I are married. I've been your stepfather since you were 6. Sequoia nodded, unsurprised. "I know. Mother told me years ago. She said you were a good man who brought money so we could eat in the lean times." "I should be there more," Cookie said. "You are there when it matters," Sequoia replied. In the winter, when the cold is hardest. The last supper on the final night before reaching the railhead in Kansas, Cookie prepared a feast. He used his hoarded treasures, a can of tomatoes, real butter, and dried apples. He baked a pie in his Dutch oven that smelled like heaven. The cowboys ate until they groaned, laughing about the dangers they had survived: the stampede, the rattlesnakes, the scurvy that Ayita's medicine had cured. Cookie sat apart, smoking his pipe. Tomorrow these men would scatter. Most he'd never see again. But tonight they were alive because of him. He turned to Sequoia. "When we get to Kansas, I'll pay your wages. $25. Take that home to your mother." "Aren't you coming home?" Sequoia asked. "Of course," Cookie said. "I've come home every winter for 15 years. I'm not about to stop now." The promise kept, and he did. When October brought the first snow, Cookie collected his wages and rode west. Ayita was waiting. His daughters ran to greet him. His son wanted to show him a new horse. Cookie dismounted with his familiar limp. Ayita came to him, her eyes smiling. "You're getting old, husband." "So are you, wife," he replied, and they laughed. That night, Cookie told her everything. "I used the knowledge you gave me," he said. "The sourdough, the herbs. I kept men alive because of you." "You kept them alive because you cared enough to ask for help," Ayita said. "Many white men would have let pride kill them." The legacy, the great cattle drives, lasted barely 30 years. Then the railroads came, and the open range closed forever. Cookie made his last drive at 47. His leg hurt too much. He took his final wages and went home to Ayita for good. They had 12 more years together before he passed away peacefully in his sleep. Their children became bridges between two worlds. The son became a respected ranch foreman. The daughters married men who honored their heritage. And that sourdough starter, it's still alive today. Somewhere in Oklahoma, a great-great-grandchild is feeding the same living yeast that connected a white cowboy and a Cherokee medicine woman across 15 years of separation. The final word: so when you see a Western movie and a solitary cowboy rides into the sunset, remember the truth. Those men weren't always alone. They had wives waiting and children growing. And that old man at the chuck wagon, he was the real hero. The man who kept everyone alive with his cooking and his medicines. But he was also a husband, a father, a man who rode away every spring knowing he might die and rode back every fall because a woman was waiting. The West wasn't built just by rugged individualism. It was built by families that bridged worlds, by women who held everything together, and by men who came back because they had something worth coming back to. Cookie and Ayita's story was never written in history books. No monuments were raised to them. But their descendants know. And now you know too. And that is legacy enough.